The moment when man first set foot upon the moon stirred the imagination of millions around the world. It had had no parallel since the 1490s, when Europeans first began to realize that vast new continents had been discovered to the west. And just as we but dimly perceive how space exploration will affect our lives, Europeans of the 1490s had little notion of how greatly the discovery of this new world was to change their society. They would soon learn, as we have of the space program, that enormous investment would be required before any material return could be expected. The earliest Spanish colonies had been sustained by rich harvests of gold and silver, and as Dominguez and Escalante found, any new territories not promising quick returns were likely to be passed by. Not one of the early English colonies paid its stockholders a significant return. Most were financial disasters. Hundreds of settlers died of famine and disease before permanent bases could be established. The Spanish and English experiences made it clear that new colonies had to find a product of great value that could be readily gathered and exported. Otherwise, their chances for success were not good. This shy, really rather charming animal was the unlikely Bonanza that first opened Utah to European and American eyes. In the 1820s, a good beaver pelt could bring $10 in the St. Louis market, the equivalent of perhaps $120 today. The lucrative fur trade was an enormous stimulus to the exploration and eventual settlement of the Mountain West. It began when fur companies established trading posts along the watersheds of major rivers, especially the Missouri. Nearby Indians trapped beaver and traded them at these posts for manufactured goods. Heavy bales of the furs were then easily shipped downriver to St. Louis. But eventually, the beaver close to the riverfront posts were depleted. As a result, in the mid-1820s, fur companies began to hire trappers to work new areas in the Rockies, far from the major rivers. These areas included parts of the Great Basin. Some of the earliest of these trappers came here to Utah. This was partly because of British-American rivalry over control of the Pacific Northwest. Utah at the time was on the southern fringes of this territory. The two countries in 1818 had agreed upon joint occupation of the whole territory, with final sovereignty to be determined by later negotiations. As a result, officers of the British Hudson's Bay Fur Company decided that the best way to keep the Americans out would be to eliminate any reason for their coming here in the first place. With the beaver all trapped out, there'd be no valuable commodity left to attract the Americans, and thus the land would be left to the British. Acting on this policy, the company in December 1824 sent out a huge expedition from its Flathead, Montana post. This entourage consisted of 131 persons with 268 horses and 352 traps. Their leader was Peter Skeen Ogden, a man of strong opinions and firm resolution. His assignment was to trap out all the best streams clear down into Utah country, leaving nothing for the Yankees. At the same time, however, an American expedition from a St. Louis-based company owned by William Ashley and Andrew Henry began to move toward Utah. Their main purpose was to increase their beaver catch and maximize their profits. Organization of the Ashley-Henry trappers had begun 2 years earlier in 1822. In that year and again in 1823, the two businessmen placed advertisements in Missouri newspapers such as this one in the St. Louis Inquirer. The subscribers wished to engage 100 men to ascend the Missouri to the Rocky Mountains, there to be employed as hunters. As a compensation to each man fit for such business, $200 per annum will be given for his services, as aforesaid. The expedition will set out from this place on or before the first day of March next. Signed, Ashley and Henry. Many who responded to ads such as this were to become famous mountain men. Most were young farm boys who saw a chance for adventure and the down payment for a farm at the end of their term. This particular group worked on salary, their expenses paid and profits claimed by the company. Others were free agents, paying their own expenses and keeping all the profits. Jim Kleiman was a surveyor who had come to St. Louis in February 1823 to pick up some back pay. There he heard of the Ashley offer and signed on to help recruit workers. He found them, he reported, in grog shops and other sinks of degradation. As they embarked on their mission, he wrote, "A description of our crew I cannot give, but Falstaff's battalion was genteel in comparison." This small but hardy crew happened to be moving westward in 1824 at the same time Peter Skeen Ogden's army of trappers was making plans to move south, both bound eventually for northern Utah. It was to be a momentous season. The Ashley Henry trappers headed westward along a route well to the south of the established trading posts on the Missouri. They were on the Sweetwater River by the early spring of 1824. Now, as you can see from the Sweetwater, the Rocky Mountains loom large and forbidding, an intimidating obstacle to anyone hoping to cross the Continental Divide to the Pacific watershed. But the Ashley Henry trappers weren't easily intimidated. They continued toward the mountains, hoping to find an opening to the western slope of the Rockies. What they found was not a narrow gorge cutting between towering mountain peaks, but an ascent so gentle to a saddle so level that you could hardly tell that it was a pass at all. It was so gentle, in fact, that even wagons could cross the backbone of the continent, a discovery that was to be of paramount importance to the westward migration which was to follow. The significance of the discovery of South Pass was not lost upon the Ashley Henry men. One of the leading figures, Thomas Fitzpatrick, was appointed to lead a small company bearing the good news of the pass and the promising beaver streams in the region back to company headquarters in St. Louis. Those who remained split into two groups. Jedediah Smith led the first, a small party that eventually made its way to the Hudson's Bay Company's Flathead post in Montana. John H. Weber led the second group of perhaps 25 to 50 down into Cache Valley, where they wintered on the Cub River. Sometime that winter, the men began to wonder where the larger Bear River flowed after it left Cache Valley. One of their company, Jim Bridger, was appointed to follow the river downstream and find out where it went. On horseback, the men followed the Bear River through the narrows connecting Cache Valley to the lower Bear River Valley and came upon a panorama looking something like this. Bridger explored the river to the lake and tasted the water. He assumed it was an arm of the Pacific. Thus, Jim Bridger and his small party in the winter of 1824-25 were probably the first white men to see the Great Salt Lake. There is one challenger to Bridger's claim to have discovered the Great Salt Lake, Etienne Provost, a trapper of French background working that same winter up into Utah from New Mexico. Provost was one of the earliest of many trappers who entered Utah from bases in the southwest, especially Taos and Santa Fe. It's possible that he saw the Great Salt Lake from the south at about the same time Bridger saw it from the north. In either case, before the summer of 1825, the mountain men had discovered the Great Salt Lake Valley as well as the route across South Pass that would make the valley accessible by wagon. This was not to be the end of their adventures that season. While Bridger and Provost were discovering the Great Salt Lake, the American party under Jedediah Smith had been giving the British a bad time. As Peter Skeen Ogden's brigade moved that spring from their Flathead post toward the Snake River country, they were dogged every step of the way by that sly, cunning Yankee, as they called Smith. Smith and his small party trapped with and sometimes ahead of the Hudson Bay group. As the Americans approached Utah, they headed south to meet with John Weber's group of Ashley Henry men. Ogden was disgusted to find that the Americans had already trapped nearly every stream along the Wasatch Front. Moving south into Ogden Valley and then into the Weber River Valley, Ogden found signs of the American presence everywhere. But that was just the beginning of his troubles. His men had learned that the Americans paid more for furs and charged less for supplies than did the British. Some of them began deserting, taking their furs with them over to the American camp. So here, in May of 1825, at Deserters Point, near Mountain Green, Utah, Ogden encountered a group of 25 Americans and 14 deserters. These rowdies, led by a trapper named Johnson Gardner, challenged the British to a fight. They claimed that the British were trespassing on American soil. In fact, they were both on Mexican soil, territory to which the Americans, but not the British, had relinquished all claim back in 1819. Faced with near mutiny among his own men, Ogden backed down and discreetly withdrew, leaving the Wasatch drainages to the Americans. Later, in 1828-29, he would lead a company to discover the Humboldt River, that vital highway across the western deserts, and return by way of the northern Great Salt Lake country. Thomas Fitzpatrick's group had, in the meantime, informed William Ashley of the fine beaver streams they'd found and the discovery of South Pass. It was perhaps this news that gave Ashley the germ of an idea that starting in 1825 was to transform the character of fur marketing in the American West. Ashley surely already realized that it would be inefficient to bring the trappers out to St. Louis at the end of each season. So he decided instead to take supplies to the trappers in the mountains and then to haul out their furs on pack animals. From 1825 to 1840, trading fairs were held each year at agreed-upon sites in the Mountain West. They called them rendezvous. This shoot, or meeting of today's mountain men of the Wasatch, is probably the closest thing in our time to the rendezvous of the mountain men. The rendezvous in the 1800s were even more raucous affairs than their present-day counterparts. Almost all the participants were, in their own way, heroic figures. Probably the most famous of all the American trappers to work in Utah was Jedediah S. Smith. Smith was in his early 20s when he first enlisted in the service of Ashley and Henry. He headed the party that discovered South Pass in 1824. He also led the group which became such a thorn in the side of the powerful Peter Skeen Ogden and Hudson's Bay Company the next year. Smith attended both the 1825 rendezvous on Henry's Fork of the Green River and the second rendezvous held probably at the southern end of the Cache Valley near Hiram. At this rendezvous, Jim Kleiman reported that he and his party had sailed around the Great Salt Lake in skin boats that spring and had been disappointed to find no promising beaver streams nor outlets from the lake. As the rendezvous broke up, Smith headed out in search of virgin trapping grounds. From that point on, he became more of an explorer than a trapper. His search for beaver streams and for a navigable river to the Pacific took him past the Great Salt Lake down into southern Utah. In fact, his route ended up following that of today's Highway 89 past Richfield and through Clear Creek Canyon to Interstate 15. Following the Virgin River to the Colorado, Smith struck across the deserts to Los Angeles. There, hostile Mexican authorities promptly ordered them to leave. He and two of his men then returned across the Sierra Nevada mountains and then the basins and ranges of present-day Nevada. After suffering terribly in the Nevada deserts, they finally came upon the familiar waters of the Great Salt Lake in the spring of 1827. Of that event, Smith wrote,
"The Salt Lake, a joyful sight, was spread before us. Is it possible, said the companions of my sufferings, that we are so near the end of our troubles? For myself, I dare scarcely believe that it was really the big Salt Lake that I saw. How those who may chance to read this at a distance from the scene may be perhaps surprised that the sight of this lake surrounded by a wilderness of more than 2,000 miles diameter excited in me those feelings known to the traveler who after a long and perilous journeying comes again in view of his home. But it was so for me, for I had traveled so much in the vicinity of the Salt Lake that it had become my home in the wilderness."
Smith and his companions hurried on to the rendezvous site on the shores of Bear Lake, near present-day Lake Town. There they were greeted with joy by the other mountain men who had assumed they had died in the deserts or had been killed by Indians. Shortly after the rendezvous, Smith left again for California, following the same route as the previous year. The journey was plagued with mishap and calamity. Indians attacked them on the Mojave Desert. Several of his party were killed, and Smith barely escaped with his life. When he reached California, Smith decided to travel up into Oregon before heading back east. Near the Umpqua River, the party was attacked again. Only Smith and 3 others escaped to spend the winter at a Hudson's Bay Company post. They then headed east to the Flathead Indian Country in Montana, where they trapped through 1829 and 1830, attending the rendezvous both years. In October 1830, Smith arrived in St. Louis, where he planned to retire from trapping and prepare his journals and maps for publication. He couldn't resist, however, joining Thomas Fitzpatrick in a trading expedition to Santa Fe. In May of 1831, while scouting alone for water along the Cimarron riverbed in western Kansas, he was attacked by Comanches and killed. He was just 32. By that time, the northern Utah country had been pretty well trapped out. Utah's first Bonanza had pretty well run its course. Shrewd businessmen to the end, Smith and his partners had sold their fur interests at the 1830 rendezvous to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, a partnership which included such notables as Jim Bridger and Thomas Fitzpatrick. They and others continued to trap the area. There was enough activity to encourage the occasional establishment of temporary trading posts. Little is known of these early posts. Most of them were in the Uinta Basin and served trappers working out of Santa Fe. Some traders, such as Jim Bridger, couldn't get this country out of their blood. They lingered into the 40s, establishing trading posts such as Fort Bridger in southwestern Wyoming and Fort Buenaventura on the Weber River. But these posts were to serve the coming overland immigrant traffic more than the fur or Indian trade. Their presence assured that the influence of the mountain men, especially in place names and travel routes, would remain until the permanent settlement of the region. The mountain men were the first to literally put Utah on the map. A cartographer in 1820, for example, made the area look like this. The Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake are dimly referred to, but with no clear detail. There's a river flowing westward to the Pacific out of the Great Salt Lake. The geography is confused and uncertain. In this later map, the scene has greatly changed, thanks in part to the mountain men. Jim Bridger had, after all, discovered the Great Salt Lake in the winter of 1824. Etienne Provost learned that same year of its relationship to Utah Lake and trapped the country between the Utah Valley and the Uinta Basin. The next year, Jim Kleiman, Moses Harris, and others paddled around the Great Salt Lake in skin boats and found it had no outlet. Jedediah Smith explored the land all the way to Los Angeles, finding no river to the Pacific. Peter Skeen Ogden could offer some hope to westbound travelers, however, with his discovery of the meager Humboldt heading off toward its alkaline sinks east of Reno. And perhaps most importantly, South Pass was charted and its existence made known in the east. Eventually, thousands of Americans would cross it with their wagons and families as they came to the west to start a new life. The American victory in the rivalry for influence in the West was clear by 1840. Encouraged by the pathfinding the mountain men had accomplished, Americans would shortly flock to Oregon and California, their trails taking them near and sometimes right through the Wasatch Front oasis. The mountain men were hard-nosed businessmen with, nevertheless, a touch of the romantic. They opened the West to America and Utah to future immigrants. More than this, their bravado set a style which has captured the imagination of thousands of Americans. From Maine to California, modern-day mountain men meet yearly in traditional dress to shoot black powder rifles, barter knives, and fur hats, and imagine themselves to be free, independent, courageous trappers of another age. We began this program by noting similarities between the fur trappers and the astronauts. And yet, the analogy fails at some points. The Apollo lunar landing crews were really more the Lewis and Clarks than the Jedediah Smiths of the space age. They came to explore, but not to harvest. And yet, who can say what harvests await the business acumen and the daring do of some modern-day Jim Bridger or Kit Carson? Surely should Tranquility Base become the cash valley of a new breed of astronauts out for quick gain and adventure, that landscape, as well as our own, would be transformed in the encounter. In the meantime, the lunar landscape remains firmly imprinted on our consciousness by the men who went there, explored its mountains and its valleys, and then left. The evidence of their passage now cluttering some Browns Hole or Ogden Valley that had not previously known the tread of their kind.